The morning started like any other Tuesday at the downtown courthouse. People shuffled through the main entrance, some nervous, some annoyed, all hoping their cases would be heard quickly so they could get back to their lives. The security checkpoint buzzed with activity as bags went through X-ray machines and metal detectors beeped occasionally. Outside, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot faster than usual. The driver's door swung open and a woman in her late 30s stepped out, clearly in a hurry. She wore dark slacks and a simple blouse. Nothing fancy, just professional enough for what she thought was going to be a routine morning. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. She checked her watch and muttered under her breath. 20 minutes late. Not a good start. Her phone had died somewhere between her apartment and the courthouse, which meant she'd missed any messages that might have come through. She'd barely had time for coffee, let alone breakfast. And now she was rushing through the parking lot trying to remember which entrance she needed. The woman had been to this courthouse dozens of times before, but always through different entrances depending on what she was doing. Today her mind was foggy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from being woken up at dawn by an urgent phone call. She'd thrown on the first professional clothes she could find and rushed out the door. As she entered through the main doors, she bypassed the public security line, flashing her badge briefly at the officers stationed there. They nodded her through without a second glance. This was normal for her. She'd done it 100 times. But today, in her rush, she took a wrong turn down one of the marble corridors. The courthouse was a maze if you didn't know it well. High ceilings, identical hallways, and doors that all looked the same. She walked quickly, her shoes clicking against the polished floor, heading toward what she thought was the right wing. But then she realized she'd gone too far. She turned back, spotting a corridor that looked familiar. That's when she ran into him. A young officer, probably mid-20s, stood at the entrance to the restricted hallway. His uniform was crisp and new-looking, and he had that eager energy of someone who takes their job very seriously. When he saw her approaching, he straightened up. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stepping slightly to block her path. "This area is restricted. Can I see your courthouse ID?" The woman stopped, a bit surprised. She reached for her badge, which was clipped to her belt, partially hidden by her blazer. "I'm law enforcement," she said, trying to keep the irritation out of her voice. "I need to get through here." The officer looked at her badge, then back at her face. His expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I need to see a valid courthouse access credential. Your detective badge doesn't grant automatic access to restricted areas." Now she was getting frustrated. "Look, I've been coming to this courthouse for years. I know where I'm going and I'm already late. Can you please just let me through?" But the young officer didn't budge. He'd been trained well and he was following every rule by the book. "Ma'am, I understand, but without proper credentials visible, I can't let you pass. If you're supposed to be in this area, you should have been issued a courthouse pass." She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The thing was, he wasn't wrong. She should have proper identification for where she was going. But in her rushed morning, she'd forgotten several things. "Can you call someone to verify who I am?" she asked. The officer nodded. "I can do that, but I'll need you to wait in the security office while I make those calls." "Protocol, ma'am." "The security office?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You want me to wait in detention?" "It's not detention, ma'am. It's just a waiting area while we verify credentials." His tone was polite but firm. He wasn't going to change his mind. She looked at her watch again. Every minute that passed made things worse. But arguing wasn't going to help. She could see in his eyes that he was committed to doing his job exactly as he'd been taught. Part of her respected that even as it annoyed her. "Fine," she said finally. "Let's get this sorted out quickly." The security office was a small room with plain walls, a few chairs, and a desk where another officer sat doing paperwork. It wasn't exactly a holding cell, but it felt uncomfortably close to one. The woman sat down, setting her briefcase beside her, and watched as the young officer picked up the phone. He started making calls, his voice professional as he tried to reach someone who could verify her identity, but things weren't going smoothly. The person he called first didn't answer. The second number went to voicemail. On the third try, he reached someone, but they couldn't access the system. "The database is down for maintenance," he said, hanging up. "They're saying it'll be another 15 minutes at least." The woman closed her eyes and counted to 10. This was turning into a disaster. She tried to remember exactly what she was supposed to be doing this morning. The early phone call had woken her from a deep sleep and the details were fuzzy. Something about filling in an emergency situation, someone being sick. But what exactly? Meanwhile, down the hall in courtroom 6, people were getting restless. The room was packed with nearly 50 people, all waiting for the morning session to begin. Lawyers shuffled papers. A young public defender kept glancing at the door, worried about her first case. An elderly woman in the front row clutched her handbag, her hand shaking slightly. The bailiff, a man who'd worked at this courthouse for 2 decades, checked his watch for the 10th time. The judge was late, very late. This wasn't like the regular judge at all. He stepped outside and made a quick call but got no answer. Something was wrong. Back in the security office, the woman tried to stay patient. She watched the young officer make call after call, genuinely trying to help but getting nowhere. The system was down. People weren't answering. It was like the universe had conspired to make this morning as difficult as possible. "How much longer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. "I'm doing my best, ma'am," the officer replied. He actually looked sorry about the situation, which made it harder to be angry at him. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The woman's patience was wearing thin. She stood up, her frustration finally boiling over. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people pay attention. "I need to speak with someone in charge right now." Her voice echoed down the hallway, loud enough that people in nearby offices could hear. The officer looked uncomfortable but stood his ground. "Ma'am, please calm down. I'm following procedure." "I understand procedure," she shot back, "but procedure is causing a serious problem right now." The commotion was getting louder. In courtroom 6, the bailiff heard raised voices coming from somewhere down the hall. He recognized that tone, that particular way of speaking that came from years of commanding a room. His eyes went wide as realization hit him like a truck. He took off running down the corridor, his heart pounding. No. It couldn't be. Please let him be wrong. But as he rounded the corner and saw the security office, he knew he wasn't wrong. And this morning had just become the most embarrassing incident the courthouse had seen in years. The bailiff came around the corner so fast he nearly slipped on the polished marble floor. His face had gone completely white and his eyes were wide with something between panic and disbelief. The young security officer looked up from his desk, confused by the sudden arrival. "What's going on?" the officer asked, standing up from his chair. The bailiff couldn't even speak at first. He just stared at the woman sitting in the security office, then back at the officer, then at the woman again. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words but couldn't quite get them out. The woman looked at the bailiff with tired eyes. "Finally," she said, "someone who knows me. Can you please tell this officer who I am so I can get where I need to be?" But the bailiff still seemed frozen. He put his hand on his forehead like he had a sudden headache. "Oh no," he whispered. "Oh no. The young officer was getting more confused by the second. "Sir, do you know this woman?" "Know her?" The bailiff's voice came out higher than usual. She's... He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. "How long has she been here?" "About 40 minutes now," the officer replied. "I couldn't verify her credentials because the system's down and nobody's answering their phones. I was just following protocol." The bailiff looked like he might faint. He pulled out his phone and checked something, scrolling frantically. Then he looked up at the ceiling as if asking the universe why this was happening to him. "Courtroom 6, he muttered. She was supposed to be in courtroom 6. The woman in the security office suddenly sat up straighter. Courtroom 6. Something clicked in her foggy memory. The early morning phone call. The urgent voice on the other end. Judge Crawford was sick. Emergency replacement needed. Report to courtroom 6 by 9 o'clock. "Oh," she said quietly, the realization washing over her. "Oh no." The young officer looked between them, completely lost now. "What's going on? Who is she?" The bailiff finally found his voice. Oh, it sounded strained. "This is Judge Mitchell. She was called in this morning to replace Judge Crawford, who called in sick. She's supposed to be presiding over a full docket in courtroom 6. Right now." The color drained from the young officer's face. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant murmur of voices from the courtroom down the hall. "A judge?" the officer whispered. "I detained a judge?" The woman, Judge Mitchell, stood up slowly. She didn't look angry now, just exhausted and maybe a little embarrassed herself. To be fair, she said, I forgot I was supposed to be a judge this morning, too. That phone call came at 5 in the morning and I barely processed what they were telling me. But the young officer wasn't hearing any of that. His face had gone from white to red, and he looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him up. Your Honor, I'm so sorry. I was just doing what I was trained to do, but I should have. I could have. You did exactly what you should have done, the judge said, cutting him off. But there wasn't time for a full discussion now. She turned to the bailiff. How bad is it in there? The bailiff winced. Well, we're about 50 minutes behind schedule. The courtroom is packed. People are getting upset. Some of them took time off work. There's a woman whose eviction hearing is supposed to be first, and she looks like she might have a panic attack. The public defender has been pacing for half an hour. Judge Mitchell rubbed her temples. This was turning into one of those days that people would talk about for years. Do you have Judge Crawford's robe in chambers? Yes, ma'am. I can get it right now, please do. And give me 5 minutes to pull myself together before I walk in there. The bailiff nodded and practically ran down the hallway. That left the judge and the security officer standing in awkward silence. The young man looked absolutely miserable, like his entire career was flashing before his eyes. I'm going to be fired, aren't I? He said quietly. Judge Mitchell picked up her briefcase and looked at him. Really looked at him. He was young, probably fresh out of training. His uniform was immaculate. His shoes were polished to a shine. Everything about him said he took this job seriously. Maybe too seriously, but that wasn't actually a bad thing. What's your name? She asked. Officer Chen, Your Honor. How long have you been working courthouse security? 2 weeks. His voice was barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly. And in those 2 weeks, have you let anyone into a restricted area without proper verification? No, ma'am. Have you made exceptions for people who looked important or claimed they were in a hurry? No, ma'am. Then you've been doing exactly what you were hired to do. She adjusted her blazer and straightened her posture. Officer Chen, this building deals with serious matters every single day. Trials, sentencing, life-changing decisions. The security here isn't just for show. It's to protect everyone inside, including judges, lawyers, defendants, and the public. He nodded, but still looked miserable. If you had just let me walk past because I flashed a badge and said I was in a hurry, what kind of security would that be? What if I hadn't been who I said I was? What if someone with bad intentions used that same tactic? I understand, Your Honor, but no buts. Her voice was firm but not unkind. You did your job. Yes, it created an awkward situation. Yes, I'm late and there's a courtroom full of annoyed people. But that's on me for not having my credentials ready and not fully waking up when I got that phone call this morning. You followed protocol and that's exactly what you should have done. The bailiff came rushing back, carrying a black judge's robe on a hanger. He was slightly out of breath. Here you go, Your Honor. Chambers are open if you need a moment. Judge Mitchell took the robe and glanced at her reflection in the glass door nearby. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes had dark circles under them, and she looked like someone who'd been detained in a courthouse security office for 40 minutes. Which, of course, she had been. No time for chambers, she said, slipping the robe on over her clothes. We're already nearly an hour behind. Let's go face the music. As she walked toward courtroom 6, she could hear the murmur of voices growing louder. The bailiff walked beside her, nervously straightening his tie. Officer Chen followed a few steps behind, still looking like he'd witnessed a disaster. Listen, the bailiff said quietly. How do you want to handle this? Should I explain what happened? Make an announcement? No announcement, Judge Mitchell said. We're just going to walk in, start the session, and get through this docket. These people have been waiting long enough. But they're pretty upset in there. I don't blame them. She paused outside the courtroom doors. Through the small window, she could see exactly what the bailiff meant. People were shifting in their seats, checking phones, whispering to each other. A woman in the front row looked close to tears. A man in a suit kept glancing at his watch and shaking his head. Judge Mitchell took a deep breath. This was going to be interesting. She'd presided over hundreds of cases in her career, but she'd never walked into a courtroom after being detained by her own courthouse security. There was probably a first time for everything. The bailiff reached for the door handle, ready to open it and make the formal announcement. But before he could, Judge Mitchell stopped him with a hand on his arm. Wait, she said. Officer Chen. The young security officer stepped forward, looking nervous. Yes, Your Honor. After this session, I want to see you in chambers. We need to talk. His face went pale again. He nodded slowly. clearly expecting the worst. But Judge Mitchell didn't explain further. She just turned back to the courtroom doors, straightened her robe one more time, and nodded to the bailiff. It was time to face the consequences of the strangest morning the courthouse had seen in a very long time. The bailiff pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, and the murmuring inside immediately stopped. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. You could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog. These people had been waiting for almost an hour, and patience was wearing thin. "All rise," the bailiff announced in his most formal voice. The Honorable Judge Mitchell presiding. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood up. But there was confusion on many faces. "Judge Mitchell?" Most of the people here were regulars who knew this was Judge Crawford's courtroom. They'd been expecting the stern older woman who usually sat at the bench. Not this younger judge in a slightly rumpled robe who looked like she'd had a rough morning. Judge Mitchell walked through the center aisle with her head held high. Even though she felt anything but dignified, she could feel dozens of eyes on her, could sense the questions people weren't asking out loud. Where had she been? Why were they so late? Who was she anyway? She climbed the steps to the bench and took her seat. The chair was slightly too low for her, adjusted for Judge Crawford's shorter height. She'd have to deal with that later. Right now she had a room full of people who deserved an explanation. "Please be seated," she said, and everyone sat down. The room went quiet again, but it was an expectant kind of quiet. People were waiting to hear what she had to say. Judge Mitchell looked out at the courtroom. In the front row, an elderly woman was clutching a folder to her chest, her eyes red like she'd been crying. Behind her, a young public defender sat with her client, a nervous-looking teenager. There were landlords and tenants, people in business suits and people in work uniforms, all mixed together because that's how justice worked. It didn't care what you wore or where you came from. "Good morning," Judge Mitchell began. "I know you've all been waiting, and I apologize for the delay. Judge Crawford called in sick early this morning, and I was called in to handle today's docket. Unfortunately, there were some unexpected complications that caused us to start late." She paused, choosing her words carefully. She wasn't going to go into details about being detained by security. That would just embarrass Officer Chen further and waste more time. These people didn't need to know the whole story. They needed to know their cases would be heard fairly. "I understand many of you have taken time off work to be here today," she continued. "I understand you have obligations and responsibilities outside this courtroom. We're going to move through this docket as efficiently as possible, while still giving each case the attention it deserves. Is that acceptable?" There were nods around the room. Some people still looked annoyed, but at least they were getting an acknowledgement of the situation. That was more than nothing. "All right then," Judge Mitchell said, pulling the first file toward her. "Let's begin. Bailiff, please call the first case." The bailiff cleared his throat. "Case number 247739, Martinez versus Greenfield Properties. Eviction hearing." The elderly woman from the front row stood up slowly, her hand shaking slightly as she approached the podium. A lawyer in an expensive suit stood up on the other side, representing the property management company. The contrast between them was stark. Judge Mitchell opened the file and scanned the details quickly. Mrs. Martinez, 72 years old, had lived in her apartment for 16 years. She'd fallen behind on rent after a medical emergency ate up her savings. Now she was facing eviction. The property company wanted her out within 30 days. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Mitchell said gently, "I see you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" The woman nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I couldn't afford a lawyer." "That's all right. Just tell me in your own words what happened." Mrs. Martinez's voice was soft and uncertain at first, but as she talked, the story came out. The heart attack last spring, the hospital bills that insurance didn't cover, the choice between paying for medicine and paying rent. She'd tried to work out a payment plan with the property management, but they'd refused. Now she was 2 months behind and they wanted her gone. The lawyer for the property company was professional but cold. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mrs. Martinez's situation, she entered into a legal contract. She hasn't paid rent for 2 months. We have a right to reclaim our property." Judge Mitchell listened to both sides, asked questions, reviewed the documentation. This was the part of her job that never got easier. The law was clear, but the law didn't always feel fair. Mrs. Martinez had broken the lease terms, there was no denying that. But evicting a 72-year-old woman who'd had a heart attack didn't sit right either. After considering everything, Judge Mitchell made her ruling. She ordered a payment plan that would allow Mrs. Martinez to stay in her apartment while catching up on back rent over 6 months. The property company's lawyer looked like he wanted to object, but the judge had structured the order in a way that was legally sound. Mrs. Martinez's face crumpled with relief, and tears started running down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much, Your Honor." Judge Mitchell gave her a small nod. "Next case, please." The morning moved forward. A dispute between neighbors over a damaged fence, a small claims case about a security deposit, a young man contesting a parking ticket who had surprisingly good evidence that the sign had been obscured by tree branches. Each case got Judge Mitchell's full attention, even though she was tired, even though her morning had been a disaster, even though she probably needed coffee more than oxygen at this point. During a brief recess, the bailiff approached the bench. "Your Honor, that was a good call on the Martinez case. Judge Crawford probably would have granted the eviction." "Maybe," Judge Mitchell said, "but Judge Crawford isn't here, and I am. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right if they're genuinely trying." She glanced toward the back of the courtroom. Officer Chen was standing by the door, still looking uncomfortable. Every now and then he'd glance her way and then quickly look away again, like he couldn't bear to make eye contact. She made a mental note to deal with that situation later. The poor kid probably thought his career was over. The recess ended and they dove back into the docket. More cases, more stories, more people whose lives intersected with the legal system in ways both big and small. A business contract dispute, a custody modification hearing that got emotional, a traffic violation that seemed straightforward until the defendant explained he'd been rushing his wife to the hospital. Judge Mitchell handled each one with the same careful attention. She asked questions. She listened to answers. She looked at evidence. She made rulings based on law and fairness in equal measure. This was what she'd spent years of her life training to do, and she was good at it, even on a day when everything had started wrong. By lunchtime, they'd made it through more than half the docket. The mood in the courtroom had shifted. People were no longer annoyed about the late start. They were watching the judge with something like respect. Word was spreading among the lawyers that Judge Mitchell was fair, that she actually listened, that she wasn't just rubber-stamping decisions. The young public defender approached during another brief break. "Your Honor, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time with my client earlier. A lot of judges wouldn't have asked those follow-up questions." "Those questions mattered," Judge Mitchell replied simply. "Context always matters." As the day wore on, Judge Mitchell found herself settling into a rhythm. The chaos of the morning was fading into the background. This was what she was supposed to be doing. Not rushing through parking lots or arguing with security officers. This. Sitting at this bench. Wearing this robe. Making decisions that affected real people's lives. But in the back of her mind, she kept thinking about Officer Chen standing by that door. She'd told him they needed to talk after the session. She'd seen the fear in his eyes when she said it. He thought he was in trouble. He thought she was going to use her authority to punish him for doing his job. She wasn't. But he didn't know that yet. And she realized that the conversation she needed to have with him was just as important as any case she'd heard today, maybe more important in its own way. The afternoon session was about to begin. Judge Mitchell took a sip of water, straightened her robe, and prepared to dive back in. The job wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The last case of the day wrapped up just after 4 in the afternoon. Judge Mitchell signed the final order and handed it to the bailiff. Her hand was cramping from all the writing, and her back ached from sitting in a chair that wasn't adjusted right, but they'd made it through the entire docket without rushing anyone or making people feel like their cases didn't matter. "That's everything, Your Honor," the bailiff said, stacking the files neatly. "Pretty impressive considering how the day started." "Thanks," Judge Mitchell replied, rubbing her eyes. "Is Officer Chen still out there?" The bailiff glanced toward the courtroom doors. "Yes, ma'am. He's been standing there for most of the afternoon. Looks like he's heading to his own execution." Judge Mitchell sighed. She'd seen the young officer checking his watch periodically throughout the day, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly dreading whatever conversation was coming. She'd let him stew long enough. "Send him to chambers, please. Give me 5 minutes to get settled first." The bailiff nodded and headed out. Judge Mitchell gathered her things and walked through the side door that led to the judge's chambers. It was a small office, neat and organized, with law books lining the walls and a desk that had probably been there since the courthouse was built. She hung up the robe, rolled her shoulders to work out the stiffness, and sat down behind the desk. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," she called out. Officer Chen stepped inside like he was walking into a trap. His uniform was still perfectly pressed despite the long day, but his face showed every bit of worry he'd been carrying around. He stood at attention in front of the desk, hands clasped behind his back. "You wanted to see me, Your Honor? Sit down," Judge Mitchell said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please." He sat, but he looked like he might bolt for the door at any second. The silence stretched out for a moment. Judge Mitchell could see him trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming. "Officer Chen," she began, "do you know why I asked you here? To reprimand me, Your Honor. Maybe to file a formal complaint." His voice was steady, but barely. "I detained a judge. I kept you from doing your job. I created a situation that could have been avoided if I'd been more flexible or used better judgment." Judge Mitchell leaned back in her chair and studied him. "That's what you think happened?" "That's what did happen, ma'am." "Let me tell you what I think happened," she said. "A security officer saw someone trying to access a restricted area without proper credentials clearly visible. He followed protocol exactly as he was trained to do. He remained professional and polite even when the person became frustrated. He attempted to verify identity through proper channels. He didn't make exceptions, didn't cut corners, and didn't let pressure change how he did his job." Officer Chen blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "Yes, it created an awkward situation," Judge Mitchell continued. "Yes, I was late to court. Yes, a room full of people had to wait. But none of that was because you did something wrong. It was because I showed up unprepared without the right credentials, rushing through the building like I owned the place. But, Your Honor, I should have recognized—" "Recognized what?" she interrupted. "You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know every judge, every lawyer, every official who comes through this building. And even if you did, that's not the point. The point is that security protocols exist for a reason, and they only work if everyone follows them. Including judges. Especially judges." Officer Chen was silent, processing this. He still looked uncertain, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Judge Mitchell opened her desk drawer and pulled out a piece of courthouse letterhead. She picked up a pen and started writing. Officer Chen watched nervously as she filled out several lines, signed at the bottom, and then slid the paper across the desk to him. "What's this?" he asked, not touching it. "Read it." He picked it up carefully and scanned the text. His eyes went wide. It was a commendation letter, praising his dedication to security protocols and professional conduct. It was addressed to the courthouse security director with a copy to go in his personnel file. "Your Honor, I don't understand," he said quietly. "I detained you. I made you late. People were upset. And you did it by following the rules," Judge Mitchell said firmly. "Officer Chen, do you know how many people try to talk their way past security in this building? How many people flash badges or drop names or act important to get special treatment? It happens every single day." He nodded slowly. "The only reason this building is safe is because officers like you don't make exceptions. You treated me exactly the same way you'd treat anyone else who couldn't show proper credentials. That's not something to apologize for. That's something to be proud of. But the inconvenience was my own fault," she cut him off again. "I got a call at 5 in the morning telling me to fill in for Judge Crawford. I was half asleep. I threw on clothes, grabbed my badge, and ran out the door without thinking about what I actually needed. I didn't check my phone. I didn't make sure I had the right identification. I didn't even fully remember where I was supposed to be going. That's on me, not you." Officer Chen looked down at the commendation letter in his hands. His expression was changing from fear to something else. Relief, maybe. Or disbelief that this conversation was going so differently than he'd imagined. "I've been standing out there all day thinking I ruined my career," he admitted quietly. "I kept replaying it in my head, thinking about what I could have done differently. Should I have made an exception? Should I have just trusted your badge? I couldn't figure out the right answer." "You already did the right thing," Judge Mitchell assured him. "Trust me, in a few weeks this is going to be a funny story. The time a judge got detained by security and then had to preside over court. But the lesson here isn't funny. The lesson is that rules matter, protocol matters, and treating everyone equally matters, even when it's uncomfortable." She stood up, and Officer Chen quickly rose to his feet as well, the letter still in his hand. "I want you to take that letter to your supervisor," she said, "and I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Don't let today make you second-guess yourself. Good security means not making exceptions, and this building needs more officers who understand that." "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, and his voice was stronger now. "I really thought, I know what you thought. But you were wrong." She smiled slightly. "Now, I've been in this courthouse for about 9 hours, most of which I spent either detained or on the bench. I desperately need coffee and food in that order. Are we good here?" "Yes, ma'am. We're good." Officer Chen left the chambers looking like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He walked a little taller, held his head a little higher. The bailiff was waiting in the hallway and raised an eyebrow in question. "She gave me a commendation," Officer Chen said, still sounding slightly stunned. "She actually thanked me for detaining her." The bailiff laughed and shook his head. "That's Judge Mitchell for you. Fair to everyone, including herself. You picked a good day to learn that lesson, kid." Back in chambers, Judge Mitchell packed up her briefcase and changed out of her wrinkled blazer. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. She looked exhausted, and she felt it too. But it had been a good day in the end. A weird day, definitely. A frustrating day, absolutely. But also a day where she'd gotten to remind herself why she'd become a judge in the first place. To be fair. To listen. To treat everyone with the same standard, whether they were a scared tenant facing eviction or a security officer just doing his job. She turned off the lights and headed out, already looking forward to that coffee. Tomorrow would be back to normal. No early morning calls, no mix-ups, no getting detained on her way to the bench. At least that was the plan. But then again, this morning had been part of the plan too, and look how that turned out. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, but people in the courthouse were still talking about it. Not in a mean way, exactly. More like the kind of story that gets told over coffee. The kind that makes people shake their heads and smile. The judge who got detained on her way to the bench. It was the kind of thing that could only happen in real life because nobody would believe it in a movie. Judge Mitchell had gone back to her regular courtroom the next day, and everything had returned to normal. Well, mostly normal. She'd started double-checking that she had all her credentials before leaving the house each morning. And she made sure her phone was always charged. Small changes, but important ones. Officer Chen had also gone back to his regular duties at the security checkpoint. But something had shifted for him too. The commendation letter had gone into his file, and his supervisor had called him in for a conversation. Not to scold him, but to tell him the courthouse needed more officers like him. Officers who didn't bend the rules for anyone. Word had gotten around among the security team about what happened. At first, Chen had worried they'd make fun of him for detaining a judge. Instead, the veterans treated him differently, with more respect, like he'd passed some kind of test without knowing he was taking it. On a Thursday morning, Chen was at his usual post near the restricted corridor, the same spot where the whole situation had started. He watched people pass by, checking badges, nodding to familiar faces, stopping anyone who looked uncertain about where they were going. Judge Mitchell came walking down the hallway, right on schedule. She had court at 9, same as always. When she saw Officer Chen, she made a point of walking over to him instead of just passing by. "Good morning, Officer Chen," she said, pulling out her courthouse credentials and holding them up clearly. "As you can see, I've learned my lesson about proper identification." He smiled, more relaxed now than he'd been 3 weeks ago. "Good morning, Your Honor. Have a good session today. I'll do my best." She started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "By the way, I heard from Mrs. Martinez yesterday. You remember her? The eviction case?" Chen nodded. He'd been standing in the back of the courtroom that day and had heard the whole thing. She made her first payment on the plan I set up. Her daughter helped her organize her finances, and she's going to be able to keep her apartment. She wanted me to know how grateful she was. "That's really good to hear," Chen said sincerely. "It is," Judge Mitchell agreed. "Days like that one remind me why this job matters. Even when they start out badly, they can still end well." She gave him a small nod and continued down the hallway. Chen watched her go, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or purpose. The idea that his small role in this big system actually meant something. That following the rules wasn't just about checking boxes. It was about keeping everyone safe so people like Mrs. Martinez could get a fair hearing. Later that afternoon, During his break, Chen was in the security office when his supervisor came in with someone else. A woman in her 50s wearing a courthouse administrator badge. "Officer Chen," his supervisor said, "this is Director Morrison from Courthouse Operations. She wanted to speak with you." Chen stood up quickly, suddenly nervous again. Had something happened? Was the commendation letter being reversed? "Relax," Director Morrison said, reading his expression. "You're not in trouble. Quite the opposite. I've been reviewing security protocols across all our courthouses, and your situation with Judge Mitchell came up in our discussions. Ma'am, what happened that morning has become a teaching example," she explained. "We're using it in training sessions for new security personnel. It's a perfect illustration of why we don't make exceptions, even when someone seems important or is in a hurry." Chen didn't know what to say to that. "The point is," she continued, "you handled a difficult situation exactly right. You stayed professional. You followed procedure. And when someone with authority got frustrated, you didn't back down. That's the kind of judgment we need in courthouse security." His supervisor nodded in agreement. "We're expanding the security team next month. Chen, we'd like you to help with training the new officers. Share your experience, teach them what you've learned." "Me? But I've only been here a few weeks." "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who recently learned the lesson themselves," Director Morrison said. "You understand why these protocols matter because you lived through a situation where following them felt difficult, but was absolutely necessary." That's valuable perspective. Chen felt that same feeling. Again, pride, purpose, the sense that he was part of something bigger than just checking badges and directing people to the right hallways. "I'd be honored," he said, after they left. Chen sat alone in the security office for a few minutes, thinking about how much had changed in 3 weeks. He'd gone from thinking his career was over to being asked to train new officers, all because he'd done his job the way he was supposed to, even when it was uncomfortable. Meanwhile, across the courthouse, Judge Mitchell was finishing up her afternoon session. It had been a busy day, full of cases that required careful attention. A custody dispute where both parents clearly loved their kid but couldn't agree on anything. A contract disagreement between two small business owners who used to be friends. A teenager who'd made a stupid mistake and needed guidance more than punishment. Each case was different, but they all had one thing in common. Real people with real problems, hoping the legal system would help them find a fair solution. Judge Mitchell took that responsibility seriously. She always had. But maybe even more so now. As she signed the last order of the day, she thought about that chaotic morning 3 weeks ago. How frustrated she'd been sitting in that security office. How embarrassed she'd felt walking into a courtroom an hour late. How tempted she'd been to pull rank and make Officer Chen feel bad about what happened. She was glad she hadn't done that. Glad she'd taken the time to think about what actually mattered. The kid had been doing his job. He'd been doing it well. Punishing him for that would have been wrong, and it would have sent a terrible message to every other security officer in the building. Instead, she'd turned an awkward situation into a teaching moment. Not just for Officer Chen, but for herself, too. A reminder that nobody was above the rules, not even judges. Maybe especially not judges. The bailiff stuck his head into chambers. "Everything wrapped up, Your Honor?" "Almost done," she replied, putting the final file in order. "Has the security staff changed shifts yet?" "Should be happening right about now. Why?" "Just curious." She stood up and stretched, feeling the usual end-of-day tiredness settling in. "I think I'll take the long way out today. Haven't walked through the main corridor in a while." The bailiff gave her a knowing look. "Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain security officer's post, would it?" Judge Mitchell smiled but didn't answer. She gathered her things and headed out through the courthouse hallways. The evening shift was indeed taking over. Officer Chen was getting ready to leave, talking with the officer who was replacing him for the night shift. When he saw Judge Mitchell approaching, he straightened up. She nodded to him as she passed. "See you tomorrow, Officer Chen." "Have a good evening, Your Honor." It was a small exchange, barely worth noticing, but it meant something. It was a judge and a security officer acknowledging each other with mutual respect. No awkwardness, no embarrassment. Just two people who'd learned something important about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. Judge Mitchell walked out into the evening air, thinking about tomorrow's docket. There would be more cases, more decisions to make, more lives intersecting with the legal system in complicated ways. It was challenging work, sometimes frustrating work, but it mattered. And tomorrow morning she'd make sure she had all her credentials ready before leaving the house. She'd charge her phone overnight. She'd check her schedule carefully, because even judges could learn from their mistakes. Inside the courthouse, Officer Chen finished his shift and headed home. He thought about the training sessions he'd be leading soon, wondered what he'd say to new officers about protocols and procedures and doing your job even when someone gets upset about it. He had 3 weeks of experience behind him now. 3 weeks of doing the job right even when it was hard. That didn't make him an expert, but it made him someone who understood why the rules mattered. Sometimes that's all you need. Someone who understands why the work matters and does it anyway, even when nobody's watching, even when it would be easier to make an exception. That's what keeps the system working. Not perfectly, because nothing human is perfect, but fairly, with dignity, with the same rules for everyone. And on a random Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, both a judge and a security officer had learned that lesson together, in the most awkward way possible. The story would keep getting told around the courthouse for years to come. And every time someone told it, they'd smile and shake their head and think about what it really means to do your job with integrity. That's not a bad legacy for one chaotic morning.